On April 21, 1918, a crimson Fokker triplane screamed through the skies over the Somme Valley, piloted by the most feared fighter ace in the world, a man who had shot down 80 Allied aircraft and whose very name struck terror into enemy pilots. Minutes later, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, would be dead, killed by a single bullet, ending a legend that had dominated the skies of World War I and creating a mystery that remains unsolved more than a century later.
Birth of a hunter. Manfred Albrecht Freiherr von Richthofen was born on May 2, 1892, into a Prussian aristocratic family with a long military tradition. The Richthofens were minor nobility, the title Freiherr translating roughly to baron, who had served the Prussian state for generations as cavalry officers and military administrators. Young Manfred grew up in an environment where military service was not just expected, but was considered the natural vocation for men of his class. As a child, Richthofen showed little interest in academics, struggling with subjects that didn't engage his competitive nature. But he excelled at athletics and outdoor pursuits, particularly hunting. The forests around his family's estates in Silesia became his playground, where he developed the skills of patience, observation, and marksmanship that would later serve him in a very different kind of hunting. "I was a terrible student," Richthofen would later write in his autobiography. "I did just enough work to avoid punishment, but no more. What interested me was sports and competition. I wanted to be the best at whatever I attempted, to defeat my opponents, to win." This competitive drive, combined with his aristocratic background, made military service inevitable. At age 11, Richthofens entered the Wahlstatt Military School, beginning the formal military education that would shape his life. He was not an exceptional cadet. His grades were mediocre and his behavior often bordered on insubordinate. But he possessed qualities that would prove valuable in war: physical courage, quick reflexes, and an absolute determination to excel in competition. In 1911, at age 19, Richthofen received his commission as a cavalry officer in the 1st Regiment of Uhlans, a prestigious cavalry unit. He embraced cavalry life, particularly the riding and the social status that came with being an officer in an elite regiment. The cavalry represented everything his class valued: dash, courage, tradition, and a romantic vision of warfare that harked back to an earlier era. But cavalry's days were numbered. When World War I began in August 1914, Richthofen rode to war expecting cavalry charges and saber duels. The reality was brutally different. Modern weapons, machine guns, artillery, barbed wire had made cavalry obsolete. Richthofen's regiment found itself relegated to reconnaissance duties and occasionally dismounting to fight as infantry. For a young officer who craved action and glory, it was frustrating and humiliating. "I had not gone to war to serve with the supply train," he wrote. "I wanted to fight, to compete, to prove myself. But there was no opportunity for that in the cavalry anymore. The horse had been replaced by the machine gun, and all we could do was watch the infantry die while we accomplished nothing." In 1915, Richthofen requested transfer to the Imperial German Air Service. Aviation was still relatively new. The Wright brothers' first flight had occurred barely 12 years earlier, but it had already become critical to the war effort. Aircraft served as reconnaissance platforms, spotting enemy positions and directing artillery fire. And increasingly, aircraft fought each other for control of the skies, giving birth to a new form of combat that combined technology with individual skill.
Learning to fly and fight. Richthofen began flight training in May 1915, starting as an observer rather than a pilot. Early military aviation was still primitive, with two-seat aircraft carrying an observer who operated a camera or machine gun while the pilot handled flying duties. Richthofen served as an observer on the Eastern Front, gaining experience in aerial operations while learning about aviation from the pilot's perspective. His early experiences in the air were not particularly distinguished. He was airsick frequently, struggled with the disorientation of three-dimensional combat, and showed no particular aptitude for aerial gunnery. But he was determined to become a pilot, believing that controlling the aircraft himself would allow him to fight more effectively. Pilot training nearly ended his aviation career before it began. Richthofen proved to be a mediocre student pilot, struggling with the delicate touch required for the fragile aircraft of the era. On his first solo flight, he crashed on landing, damaging the aircraft and earning a severe reprimand from his instructor. His final flight evaluation noted, "Not a natural pilot, skills adequate for military purposes, but nothing exceptional." Despite this inauspicious beginning, Richthofen earned his pilot's license and was assigned to fly two-seat reconnaissance aircraft on the Eastern Front. It was unexciting work, flying observation missions, occasionally dropping small bombs, and generally supporting ground operations, but it gave him flying experience and, critically, his first opportunity for aerial combat. The transformation from mediocre pilot to deadly fighter pilot began when Richthofen met Oswald Boelcke in August 1916. Boelcke was already Germany's leading ace with more than 20 victories and was in the process of forming a new fighter squadron, Jagdstaffel II, or JAS-2. Boelcke was looking for pilots who showed potential for fighter operations, and he saw something in Richthofen despite his unremarkable record. "Boelcke selected me for his squadron," Richthofen wrote. "I could hardly believe it. Here was Germany's greatest ace, and he thought I could become a fighter pilot. From that moment, I was determined to justify his faith in me and to become the greatest pilot I could be." Boelcke didn't just recruit pilots, he trained them systematically, using principles he had developed through experience. His famous Dicta Boelcke outlined basic fighter tactics: secure an advantageous position before attacking, use the sun to mask your approach, attack from behind and below when possible, never break off an attack once committed, and maintain team cohesion in combat. These principles, which seem obvious now, were revolutionary in 1916, when most pilots fought instinctively without systematic doctrine. Under Boelcke's tutelage, Richthofen absorbed these lessons and added his own insights drawn from hunting. Aerial combat is like hunting. You must be patient, wait for the right opportunity, and then strike decisively. The pilot who shoots first rarely wins. The pilot who shoots from the best position wins. Richthofen scored his first confirmed victory on September 17, 1916, shooting down a British FE-2B over Cambrai, France. The kill was not particularly elegant. He attacked the slow British observation aircraft from behind, firing multiple bursts until it went down. But it confirmed that he could succeed in aerial combat, and from that moment, his score began to climb steadily.
The rise of the Red Fighter pilot. By early 1917, Richthofen had become one of Germany's leading aces, with 16 confirmed victories. His success came from a combination of factors: excellent eyesight that allowed him to spot enemy aircraft before they saw him, tactical patience that prevented him from taking unnecessary risks, superb marksmanship developed through years of hunting, and an almost scientific approach to combat that emphasized analyzing each engagement to improve his techniques. Boelcke had died in a mid-air collision in October 1916, a tragic accident that devastated his squadron. Richthofen, who had idolized his mentor, was determined to carry on Boelcke's legacy. He continued to develop and refine the tactical principles Boelcke had taught, and he began to emerge as a leader and instructor himself. In January 1917, Richthofen was given command of Jasta 11,
his own fighter squadron. It was a significant promotion, recognizing both his combat success and his leadership potential. He immediately set about molding the squadron according to his principles: aggressive patrolling, teamwork in combat, careful selection of targets, and constant training to improve skills. It was around this time that Richthofen began painting his aircraft red. The reason has been debated by historians. Some suggest it was psychological warfare, making himself unmistakable to intimidate enemies. Others believe it was simply personal preference, or a way to ensure other German pilots didn't accidentally fire at him. Richthofen himself offered contradictory explanations at different times, suggesting the truth may have been a combination of factors. Regardless of the motivation, the bright red Albatros D3 fighter became Richthofen's signature. Allied pilots began reporting encounters with the Red Devil, or Le Diable Rouge. British newspapers, always eager for dramatic stories, dubbed him the Red Baron, a nickname that stuck and eventually became more famous than his actual name. The spring of 1917, Bloody April, as British pilots called it, saw Richthofen and his squadron achieve unprecedented success. New German fighters, particularly the Albatros D3 and D5, outperformed most British aircraft. German tactics, refined by veterans like Richthofen, were superior to British doctrine. And Richthofen himself was at the peak of his abilities, shooting down 21 British aircraft in April alone. During this period, we enjoyed complete superiority, Richthofen wrote. The British were brave, but poorly trained and badly equipped. It was almost unfair. They kept sending up young pilots in obsolete aircraft, and we shot them down in droves. I felt sympathy for them, but war allows no room for sympathy. My duty was to shoot them down, and I did so. By summer 1917, Richthofen's score had reached 50 confirmed victories, making him Germany's leading ace by a wide margin. He had become a national hero, featured in newspapers and newsreels, awarded Germany's highest military decoration, the Pour le Mérite, known as the Blue Max, and personally recognized by Kaiser Wilhelm II. The German propaganda machine made full use of his success, presenting him as the embodiment of German martial virtue. But success came with costs. Richthofen suffered a serious head wound in July 1917 when a British bullet creased his skull during a dogfight. He recovered, but the injury left him with persistent headaches and may have affected his judgment. Friends and fellow pilots noticed changes in his personality after the wound. He became more withdrawn, less enthusiastic about combat, and occasionally spoke of premonitions about his own death. "I am no longer the hunter," he confided to his brother Lothar, also a fighter pilot. "Now I am the hunted. Every British pilot wants to be the one who kills me. They know who I am, they know my aircraft, and they're hunting me as I once hunted them. It's only a matter of time before one of them succeeds." Despite these dark thoughts, Richthofen continued flying combat missions through late 1917 and into 1918. His score climbed to 60, then 70, then 80 confirmed victories, an unprecedented achievement that remains one of the highest scores of any fighter pilot in history. He commanded Jagdgeschwader 1, a formation of 4 squadrons known as the Flying Circus, because of its brightly painted aircraft and its practice of moving between different sectors of the front to concentrate force where needed.
The final flight. By April 1918, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. Germany's spring offensive had initially made spectacular gains, but was beginning to bog down in the face of British and French resistance, reinforced by arriving American forces. In the air, new British fighters, the Sopwith Camel and SE-5A, had largely negated German technical advantages. Allied pilots were better trained and more experienced than the hapless novices of 1917, and the Allies enjoyed numerical superiority, with Britain and France able to replace losses faster than Germany. Richthofen, now 25 years old, looked older. The head wound, constant combat stress, and the weight of command had aged him. He spoke openly about his certainty that he would be killed, writing to his mother, "I am in wretched spirits after every battle. When I set foot on the ground again, I go to my quarters and do not want to see anyone or hear anything. I believe I will not survive this war." His superiors, recognizing his value as a propaganda symbol, had repeatedly suggested he retire from combat flying and take a staff position. Each time, Richthofen refused. "A leader must lead," he insisted. "I cannot ask my pilots to risk their lives while I sit safely behind a desk. I will fly until I am killed or the war ends." On the morning of April 21, 1918, Richthofen led a patrol from the aerodrome near Capy, France. He was flying his distinctive red Fokker DR-1 triplane, a highly maneuverable but somewhat obsolete aircraft that he preferred despite the availability of newer models. His formation consisted of 5 aircraft from Jasta 11, hunting for British aircraft over the Somme Valley. Around 10:30 a.m., they spotted a flight of Royal Air Force Sopwith Camels from No. 209 Squadron, conducting a low-level attack against German positions. Richthofen led his formation down to attack, and within moments the sky erupted into a swirling dogfight. Canadian pilot Lieutenant Wilford May, a novice on his first combat patrol, found himself being chased by Richthofen's red triplane after May's guns jammed during the initial engagement. May, following instructions to disengage if his guns failed, dove away and headed for Allied lines at low altitude, desperately trying to escape. Richthofen pursued, fixated on this easy target, flying lower and lower as May twisted and turned just above the ground. In his focus on May, he violated several of his own tactical principles. He had separated from his formation, he was flying at low altitude where he couldn't maneuver freely, and he was pursuing deep into Allied territory. Canadian Captain Arthur Roy Brown, May's flight commander, saw his squadron mate in trouble and dove to help, firing at Richthofen's triplane as he passed. Brown later claimed he saw his bullet strike the red aircraft, but the angle was poor and he couldn't be certain of the results. At the same moment, Australian ground forces were firing at Richthofen's low-flying aircraft with machine guns and rifles. Multiple witnesses later claimed they saw the red triplane flying overhead and fired at it. Richthofen's triplane staggered, then made a rough landing in a field near the Bray-Corby Road, in territory controlled by Australian forces. Soldiers ran to the crashed aircraft and found Richthofen dead in the cockpit, killed by a single bullet that had entered his right side, passed through his chest, and exited near his left nipple. The trajectory of the bullet, from right to left and slightly upward, would become critical evidence in the debate over who killed him.
The mystery and the legend. The question of who killed Manfred von Richthofen has never been definitively answered and remains one of World War I's enduring mysteries. The official credit went to Captain Roy Brown, who was formally recognized for the victory. But the evidence is ambiguous at best. Brown's attack came from above and behind, meaning his bullets would have entered Richthofen's aircraft from above and traveled downward. The fatal bullet's trajectory, entering from the right side and traveling upward, is inconsistent with Brown's angle of attack. This has led many historians to conclude that Richthofen was actually killed by ground fire from Australian machine gunners or riflemen firing upward at the low-flying triplane. Multiple Australian units claimed credit for the kill. Sergeant Cedric Pupkin, a machine gunner with the 24th Machine Gun Company, appears to be the most credible claimant based on position and the ballistic evidence, but certainty is impossible. Multiple men were firing at the red triplane, and in the chaos of combat, determining which bullet struck the fatal blow is beyond the available evidence. What is certain is that Richthofen, who had survived 80 aerial combats and countless close calls, was killed by a single bullet in his final flight, whether fired from the air by a fellow pilot or from the ground by an anonymous soldier. That bullet ended the career of history's most famous fighter pilot and created a legend that would outlive everyone involved. The Allies, recognizing they had killed a worthy opponent, accorded Richthofen full military honors. Australian soldiers buried him with dignity, Royal Air Force officers attended the funeral, and a wreath was dropped on the German aerodrome bearing the inscription, "To Captain von Richthofen, a gallant and worthy foe." Germany mourned the Red Baron as a national hero. His death was announced publicly, and memorial services were held throughout the country. Kaiser Wilhelm II personally expressed condolences to Richthofen's family. The propaganda value of his exploits was too great to lose, and his memory was carefully cultivated as an example of German courage and martial skill.
The complex reality behind the legend of the Red Baron. The legend of the Red Baron, cultivated by both German propaganda during the war and popular culture afterward, presents a romantic figure, the chivalrous knight of the air, fighting honorable duels above the mud and blood of the trenches. The reality was more complex and often darker. Richthofen was, by his own admission, a hunter rather than a warrior seeking glory. "When I have shot down an Englishman, my hunting passion is satisfied for a quarter of an hour," he wrote. This cold-blooded view of combat, seeing enemy pilots as prey rather than worthy opponents, contradicts the romantic image of the chivalrous ace. He was also pragmatic and unsentimental about tactics. Richthofen preferred to attack damaged aircraft, stragglers, or novice pilots, targets less likely to fight back effectively. He emphasized attacking from advantageous positions and breaking off if the situation became unfavorable. These were sound tactical principles that kept him alive, but they weren't particularly chivalrous. "The aim is to shoot down the enemy," Richthofen explained. "How you do it doesn't matter. Tricks, surprise, ambush, use everything. A man who fights fair is a fool. Fight to win and live to fight another day." His attitude toward his victims was notably callous. While some aces visited wounded enemy pilots in hospitals or expressed regret over killing brave opponents, Richthofen seemed largely indifferent to the men he shot down. He kept trophies from his victories, serial numbers from downed aircraft, pieces of fabric, sometimes personal items from killed pilots, displaying them in his quarters like hunting trophies. Yet there were contradictions. Richthofen could be thoughtful and introspective, particularly after his head wound. He recognized the futility of the war and the waste of young lives. He expressed sympathy for the British pilots being sent up against his veteran squadron. And he was genuinely concerned for the welfare of his own pilots, training them carefully and taking losses in his squadron personally. "I am no hero," he wrote late in the war. "I fight because it is my duty, and I am good at it. But I take no pleasure in killing men, and I will be glad when this war is over, and I can return to hunting animals rather than men."
The enduring legacy. More than a century after his death, Manfred von Richthofen remains the most famous fighter pilot in history. His name is recognized even by people with no interest in military history, and the Red Baron has entered popular culture as a synonym for ace pilot or exceptional achievement. The legend has been embellished, romanticized, and commercialized. The Red Baron has appeared in countless books, films, songs, and even as a mascot for pizza. Much of this popular culture bears little resemblance to the actual historical figure, the complex, sometimes cold-blooded Prussian aristocrat who excelled at a grim profession during humanity's first industrialized war. The real Richthofen was neither the chivalrous knight of popular legend nor the bloodthirsty killer of some revisionist accounts. He was a professional soldier who found his calling in aerial combat, developed his skills through systematic analysis and practice, and achieved unprecedented success through a combination of tactical intelligence, marksmanship, and aggressive leadership. His 80 confirmed victories, and possibly more unconfirmed, remain one of the highest scores in fighter aviation history. Only a handful of pilots from World War II exceeded his total, and they did so with more advanced aircraft and longer combat careers. For a pilot who flew from late 1916 to April 1918, less than 2 years of combat flying, his achievement was extraordinary. But the legend obscures an important truth. Richthofen was the product of a military system, flying aircraft designed by engineers, supported by mechanics and logistics personnel, and enabled by the industrial might of Imperial Germany. His individual skill mattered, but so did the system that trained him, equipped him, and allowed him to fight effectively. His death at age 25, in the final months of a war Germany would lose, adds a tragic element to his story. He had become a symbol of German military prowess, yet he died knowing that Germany was losing, and that his victories, however spectacular, hadn't changed the war's ultimate outcome. He expressed this awareness in his final writings, recognizing that individual heroism couldn't overcome strategic realities. The debate over who killed Richthofen continues among historians and aviation enthusiasts, with new analyses and theories appearing regularly. But perhaps the identity of the shooter matters less than the larger truth that warfare in the industrial age had become so destructive and impersonal that even the greatest individual warrior could be killed by an anonymous bullet from an unknown source. The age of individual heroes had given way to the age of mass warfare, where individual skill and courage were increasingly overwhelmed by industrial firepower. Today, visitors can see Richthofen's restored red Fokker triplane in museums, along with his personal effects, photographs, and memorabilia. These physical artifacts connect us to a man who lived a century ago, who fought in a war that shaped the modern world, and whose name has become synonymous with aerial combat excellence. The Red Baron's story remains compelling not because it's entirely true to the legend, but because it represents something fundamental about human nature, the desire for individual achievement and recognition even in the collective horror of modern warfare, the tension between chivalry and brutality, and the tragic waste of young lives in conflicts whose causes and purposes are forgotten, while individual stories endure. Manfred von Richthofen died on a spring morning in 1918, killed by a bullet whose origin remains disputed. But the legend he created, intentionally or not,
outlived him, outlived everyone who knew him, and continues to capture imaginations more than 100 years later. In that sense, the Red Baron achieved a form of immortality that few people ever attain, becoming not just a historical figure, but an enduring symbol of skill, courage, and the eternal human fascination with those who excel at dangerous professions.
If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so we can keep creating more content.